One of Britain's major vulnerabilities is its undersea cables. We're now basically a service economy. It's like 70% of our economy is now service-based. It's estimated that some 60 cables that relies on massive amounts of data being moved around. Everything from information itself on stocks and shares, through to money, through to communications, and all the information that goes with it from there. That creates a vulnerability we're not at the moment able to protect as well as perhaps we might. Leading from the UK elsewhere, covers like £1.5 trillion worth of financial information and data every single day. Cutting any one of those cables could create a problem. Cut a number of them, and you start to have the breakdown of all sorts of systems, financial, personal, social, across the country as a whole. For many years, the UK has been very much aware of what's known as the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. And this basically is a stretch of water that, if properly controlled, limits the ability of Russian vessels to exit from their bases in the Kola Peninsula alongside northern Norway out into the Atlantic. And it's from there that the threat would actually come, which might end up cutting our cables. One of the challenges with defending our cyber infrastructure, particularly our cables, is we don't necessarily recognise how important they are to our everyday life. But as they are the major source of information and data that flows around, everything from food supplies coming in, which are put onto our supermarket shelves, through to the operations of the National Health Service, trains, aircraft, air traffic control, all rely on data being moved through cables, and particularly in things like aircraft movement, that needs to be moving across the channel or to other parts of the world in order to support air traffic control. So an attack on those cables, whether direct or a cyber attack which actually interfered with the data, would have a major effect on our economy, our society, because very quickly law and order may break down if the supermarket shelves started to empty. And so the vulnerability of our cables to attack by Russia or indeed any other so-minded enemy is a real issue, and it's very hard to manage. We've got miles and miles of cables underwater. The underwater environment is one of the most hostile and difficult ones to protect against, and the whole time we haven't necessarily got the resilience in place which would allow us then to switch movement of data from one cable to another. And so how we protect ourselves is really, it's going to be one of the key battlefields, if you like, for the next few years. We know how important the Greenland is to our security, not just the US security, and we know that from President Trump's talking about it at the moment in terms of even potentially annexing it. But we still need to have that ability to control that gap between Greenland, Iceland and the UK for our own interests as well. President Trump doing what he's doing at the moment, talking about taking it over, i.e. taking it over completely, annexing it all, creates a huge difficulty. Because Greenland is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark itself, one of our key NATO allies, particularly in relation to the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is ourselves, the Baltic countries and Denmark itself. Indeed, if President Trump chose to annex Greenland itself, there is a real question mark about the survival of the NATO alliance itself. The challenge for the UK is what would we do if indeed President Trump annexed Greenland itself. And so the NATO alliance would probably split and we'd find ourselves in a position then in Europe as potentially one of the lead European powers and potentially one of the lead military powers trying to help to rebuild a sort of European side of NATO itself. At the moment, though, we simply don't have the resources properly devoted to defence to do that. But I think people would look to Britain as a leadership country, a member of the P5, the Security Council of the United Nations, a nuclear power, to help to rebuild a kind of European side of NATO itself. Now, we hope that President Trump will not do that. I think everyone recognises how important Greenland is to the US security, and the Danes and the Greenland people themselves have made clear to Trump that if he feels in order to defend the North America that more US military resources need to be placed into Greenland, they are absolutely prepared to accept this and go along with it. What they're not prepared to accept is an annexation of Greenland by the United States. There's always then the issue of how President Putin would actually respond to that. In terms of the US annexing Greenland, he would actually use that as an excuse for his own attempted annexations of Ukraine and indeed his ambitions elsewhere. But it places the UK then in a very much more vulnerable and precarious position itself. We would then become the lead military power within Europe, seen as being the people who are going to lead a renaissance of European military power, and we'd also then be vulnerable to any attack from Russia itself. Russia already has a sort of slightly paranoid view of the UK, not really justified by our actual defence expenditure, but by a sort of magnified view of Britain, perhaps based on its imperial past and the times in the past when we have opposed and fought against Russia's interests, whether it be the Crimean War in the 1850s, 1919 when we interfered in the Russian Revolution, and more recently where we were the lead power, leading almost in advance even of the United States in terms of supporting Ukraine after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. We also have to understand what Putin's reaction to this would be. We hope, of course, that Trump doesn't annex Greenland itself, but no doubt there will be an increase of the US military and defence presence in that country. And then how would Russia react to that? For Russia, the Arctic, and particularly the ability to move goods and transit through the Arctic, is key to its future. And it would see any challenge in that area as something that needed a further response. They're already partly the way there. They've got considerably more icebreakers than the US have got. And we'd expect an increase in Russian military presence and strategic threat in that area.